Welcome to Agency Ascend, the podcast where we help independent insurance agents and agents alike elevate their businesses to new heights. I'm your host, Chris Terlacey, managing partner of our insurance network, and with me today is our moderator, Jessica McBurney. Welcome.
Hey, y'all. Super excited about our podcast today. We have a special guest that sits not too far from our own office, and he's going to be bringing in a lot of value about something we talked about on my original podcast, contracts, the do's and don'ts, some insider information on how to look through all of that, which I'm stoked.
So without any further ado, I want to introduce John Sutter. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Chris. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. You've been in the industry going on, what,
46
5 months?
years?
What is it,
really.
46 years?
It seems like 5 months, but it's 46 years.
So John brings over 46 years of insurance experience, including agency ownership, leadership roles, and a deep understanding of risk management. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, you're certified. What are all the alphabet soups behind your name?
I am a CPCU, can't produce, can't underwrite, and an associate in risk management and ARM as well. I am a licensed risk manager as well as a agent in Texas.
Wow. Welcome. Glad to have you.
Glad to be here.
I think what would be beneficial for our listeners is to kind of hear what got you here, because now you're working at Comerica. You've been the president. Can you unfold for our listeners? I know the backstory behind this, and I think it's one of the best ones I've heard thus far.
Well, so, I would like to say that I was destined for this moment from the very beginning, but no, it was an odd occurrence that took place. So I was with a agency called Unimark. I was a minor partner president of that agency, and we specialized in large accounts and went through a period where we lost several of our largest clients. And so, as I like to tell people, we were circling the toilet bowl because we lost like $2.5 million worth of revenue in a year. Wow. And trying to replace that is an almost impossible thing to do. We had a longtime agent, John Crooks, who had been with us for about 20 years, and he was nervous about that situation. Yeah. So he left and came over to what was then Sovereign Insurance, and against, in my opinion, his agency contract and his non-compete, began to bring business over to Sovereign. So I sued Sovereign and John Crooks, which brought us to the attorney's office where I met Mike Sterlacey for the very first time. And that is a unique experience. So we're there in the attorney's office, and Mike begins by saying, "John, it's great to be here. We're going to work out a deal with John Crooks. That's not a problem. But what you have to understand is this is like a divorce. John's been with you a long time, 20 years. He just doesn't love you anymore. But, we've got to, protect the children, meaning the accounts, or, if it's a bitter divorce, they're all going to lose, and we're all going to lose here. So we're going to work out a deal." And so I'm sitting there across from this man who's taking my lawsuit and turning it into a divorce settlement. We went ahead and we went through it, and we were able to work out the deal. And he says, "What I'm really interested, John, is I've heard great things about you. I want to have you join us. I want to go ahead and have you and Unimark join the Sovereign family." And I said, "Mike, I'd like to talk about that, but the reason I'm here instead of my partner Charlie is because he said if he were in this room, he would kill everybody in here. So we're not going to be able to to talk about that now." And we didn't, but we stayed in touch. And about a year later, I went to Charlie and I said, "Charlie, we really need to look at selling to what was now Comerica." And he said, "No way, we're not going to deal with those people." And I said, "Well, let me remind you that in another year, the non-compete that we negotiated with the sale to John Crooks is going to run out. And the entire strength of Comerica is going to come back against everything we have." And he said, "Well, why don't you go ahead and talk to him?" So making a long story just a little bit longer, we were able to work out the deal. Charlie retired. I came to Comerica, and as I tell everybody that I tell that story to, I wish I'd have sued Mike 10 years earlier. My life would have been a whole lot easier and better if I'd have been able to do that. So that's what brought me to Comerica.
That's excellent. So I think one of the big thrusts that we want to get into in this particular episode is some of those nuances within the contract. I mean, you just went through a phenomenal story of explaining how non-competes work with producers joining other agencies. We could even go into legacy, like how the succession planning of that agency works when you've lost a few key contracts. I mean, we can go all sorts of areas, but one of the things that, let's just start the conversation off on is non-competitions. In this instance, you had a producer that left to join a competing, we now call it a co-opetition, right?
Co-opetition.
Yeah,
yes.
We're competing for the business, but we eventually became partners. So you turn an opponent into a partner. In any situation that you're dealing with, you can more or less do that as long as you're staying ethical and making certain that you pay for that business.
That the kids are taken care of.
And you don't want to make it so adversarial to where you have subpoenas going out to all of your sub-agents. I mean, not sub-agents, but your clients, because that's not good for anybody. What are some of the unique things that you look for in, say, a non-competition? Because I know you review a lot of those legal documents.
You're going to look at what obligations the producer has agreed to, by the contract. So it's normally going to center around what he can't do, is how those contracts tend to run. So they're going to talk about, you're not allowed to take information, you're not allowed to take files. It will get into, is there an area that he can't operate in? You're seeing less and less of that because those have been struck down by courts. It used to say, well, you can't do it within the state of Texas.
Right.
Okay. Can't do that anymore. But, there'll be some sort of restriction on what they can do. What it basically boils down to, and what I think everybody wants at the end of the day from someone that's been a producer for them, is if you leave, don't take the business with you.
Right.
You're okay to go work somewhere else. I'm fine with that. That's how you make your living. Just leave your hands off of, the accounts that you had while you were here. And that's either that you wrote or that you solicited, or that the agency wrote or solicited, because if you're with someone and you're working in a company, you're not going to know information about just your own clients. You will know about the agency clients. So that's what you're really looking for, is how's the wording around that? What's the period of time? Usually it'll be 2 years, sometimes a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, but you're looking for that period, and you're trying to evaluate what can they do during that period and what can they do after that period.
Well, and I think another point within that, and you've made this recommendation to me before when I'm working with agents, is go ahead and pre-negotiate if they were to leave, or if this relationship were to unravel and they were to take that you go ahead and set up a multiple, so that way, A, you keep it out of court, but B, you agree to what the rules of engagement would look like.
You can try to do that, and we've been pretty successful at it with Comerica in doing that and putting the multiple in. Sometimes the producer is a little reluctant to talk about that because he's trying to get the job, or he's just got the job, and he doesn't already be talking about, well, when I leave, this is what's going to take place. But it's always good to have that conversation ahead of time and clear it up. You have to be careful with the multiples or some sort of formula, because things change. And what could have been a multiple that was a good solid multiple at one time, 4 to 5 years later, may be either grossly overpaying or grossly underpaying for that business. I think it's more important to have the door open for that discussion.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking to producers maybe that are working somewhere else or that are looking, contacting us, we'll talk to them and say, go to the leadership, go to your immediate supervisor, go to the leadership of the agency and ask them, if I leave, can I take my book or part of my book with me, and what would that look like? Because you want to be open and front, to the point you were making, be open and honest with everybody that you're dealing. And so if you get that out front, it's less important than having the actual formula, is to say, this can be done. We'd rather have you come to us and talk to us about it than leaving and doing something after the fact. But either way works.
For our listeners, just to kind of break that down a little bit, because I know you guys could get high level pretty quickly. Can y'all break down what is that multiple that you're talking about, and what does that look like for a producer that may be having that discussion? Okay,
so when you're looking at buying an agency or a book of business with insurance, there's a couple of different ways to do it. You can do an EBITDA model where you do certain multiples of EBITDA, which is the earnings before income tax, or as we were talking about, when we say multiples, it's multiple of the amount of commission. Mm-hmm. Okay, the total amount of commission times a multiple. So that can be 1.5 times, 2 times, 2.5 times, and that's the formula that you use to get the value of the agency and the purchase price.
Yeah, and I would say each agency is going to be evaluated slightly different. If they have a lot of technology and they're utilizing a management system and have good tracking of the data, that's going to be usually lend itself to a higher multiple on that chart, versus if it's a one-time where you're paying for all of the business, just it's a lump cash that I'm offering that will typically offer a lower multiple of revenue because the risk is falling on the buyer more so than the seller. So if you set it up to where instead you're doing it as a 3-year with a buyout that's based upon renewal, you can typically get a higher multiple and spread it out. And it also helps with capital gains and some of the other deals.
This sounds like we could get into a whole merger and acquisition conversation
Well, and that's
here.
what Chris is actually talking about, is more about acquisition. If you're going to liberate someone from another agency, it's going to be a multiple. It's going to probably be paid cash up front. There's no carve back. There's no anything. You're trying to get him to come over with as much business as they can. And what are you willing to pay for that? So
You're buying the business that they've already produced. And y'all were talking about, hey, potentially a producer might be able to negotiate that up front if... Was that kind of the premise of it? Is if I ever wanted to leave one day, this is how we would amicably divorce?
Well, so we even talk about that on our network. I have a lot of agencies that are curious about setting up producers, bringing some expertise in that may one day want to own their own agency. If you know that's one of their goals, then you say, okay, well, let's talk about that. If you hit this threshold, this is what it would look like. And as long as they're being part of that and they know that they have that option, I think in most cases you'll find that they won't leave because it's, setting up all the carrier contracts. It's not as easy. This is what we do. This is our bread and butter. It isn't easy.
Absolutely. That actually brings up a really good point you make there, Chris, in what is the difference in being an agency owner versus working for an agency. And John, you've really been on all sides, right? And I'm really interested, and I think our listeners would be super interested to hear about your time in the captive channel, can I say it that way? And being an agency owner, and then what built your decision or what circumstances brought you to a different path?
Okay. They are totally different, as you would expect. So, as a producer, you're working to bring business on board so that you can get paid. You get your new commission, you get your renewal commission. When you are an owner, it's a completely different operation. You are building a business, and so you're going to want to, have that entrepreneurial drive to want to do that because there's risk involved. That's what entrepreneurs do, is they have risk, they have sweat equity, and at the end of the day, they have a payoff that's different from a producer. A producer is paid for what he does. To your point, I did spend some time in the captive agency channel. I was a business lines agent, a BLA for Nationwide Insurance, back when they first made the decision that was what they wanted to try to do. So they had, to that point in time, pretty much been only east of the Mississippi, but wanted to take a foray into commercial insurance west of the Mississippi. Texas was one of the first states they came to. I was not part of the original class, but I followed about a year after that. And the program was 3-year development, and then you went out and opened your agency. That was, a whole nother segment in itself because when they first came to Texas, they had a 50% deviation that they were just using all over the place, buying business left and right. You could write anything at all. By the time I was interviewing, they were down to a target market list. And by the time I was hired and went into training, they had pretty much shut all new production off. And we had to validate by selling life insurance only for the 6 months, first 6 months. And then it gradually got better after that. I did spend time with that. That is different because I had been on the independent agency side as a producer first. So I had worked for a family agency, about 50 employees, about 50% personal, 50% commercial. And that's where I had the good fortune to come into my primary mentor, who was Earl Stevens, who had been a vice president for the little Aetna. And so he took me under his wing and really taught me a lot about insurance and gave me the drive to look at the technical side. So I was there with Diversified, which was owned by my father-in-law, which was an exciting experience in itself. Chris knows working for his dad, it's a little bit different. Well, father-in-laws are the same thing.
Yeah.
And so there came a point in time when I said, I really need to look at this on my own. So I went and actually did a sidestep and worked with my dad for 6 months in the property tax business and found out I couldn't work for my father. Came back to Dallas and got into Nationwide. So I was a business lines agent there. And so, of course, you look at that contract and you study that contract, and it's pretty simple. It says you're going to do pretty much everything that you produce and sell is going to be according to what Nationwide wants to do.
Yeah.
And they will have different quotas that you have to make, and those can change. And it's a pretty one-sided contract for the most part. They're going to say, you're going to represent Nationwide and Nationwide only. If there's something that Nationwide doesn't want to write, they did have a brokerage, III, that you could place that business with, but that was all we were allowed to do.
Right. Well, it's the captive. It's the captive.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's captive. I was committing to Nationwide, and I had no problem with that.
Right.
It was a good system. It was writing commercial insurance. Had a good run with it. Opened up, after my 3 years, opened up an agency in Plano with another agent, Jerry Huff. And we had that agency until Nationwide brought us all together and said, our results are not what we want them to be from a loss standpoint. So we're going to begin to re-underwrite all of the business. And if it's not profitable, we're going to non-renew it. And I kind of held up my hand and I go, excuse me, if you non-renew business at the beginning of the year, those of us that have more business in the front end than in the back end, we're going to lose a lot of our business. And then you're going to realize halfway through the year that you made a terrible mistake. You're going to turn it back on, but it's going to be too late. That's, I've seen that happen with carriers, and I just know that's going to happen. And I said, did anybody think about maybe just non-renewing worst performing accounts that we have for 15% of the agency? Because everybody could take a 15% hit. That would get rid of all of the really bad accounts, and you'd be in good shape. And they said, no, we didn't look at it. We're not going to look at that. Patted me on my head. And I said, and I made my second statement, and I said, well, there was a room of about 60 of us. And I said, if you go this route, then I'm looking around saying 25 of these agents won't be here when September rolls around, because this was in January. And September rolled around, and I was off one by my projection because I was the 26th. That didn't make it to the end.
How many years ago was that? Because I would say it's very different than today.
This is back in, let's see, this would have been in like 85 to 88, probably 89 is when I left that relationship. So,
yeah. Wow.
Long time ago.
Yeah, I think for a future episode, we definitely need to talk about family and the business.
That's a good one.
Yeah, that's
dynamics of working with
the
your
joys
family.
and pains.
That's exactly
Talk
right.
about turning opponents into partners and back again.
Well, so, looking at the different agreements, what were some of those exit terms that you saw? Because I know selfishly today we see legislation being put in place where non-competes are not going to be honored in the sense of moving employees from one organization to another. But from what I understand, the asset that's there, i.e. the book, the non-compete still holds up for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So with Nationwide, even back then, they owned the business. Okay, I mean, it was my agency, but at the end of the day, I couldn't take it with me if I left Nationwide. It would stay with them. They would pay a percentage, multiple on the book when you left. And then what they would do is they would then take that book and turn around and, in effect, sell it to another Nationwide agent, who might bid on it and say, well, I'll go ahead and take it for this, or I'll do it under these terms. That gave them a better chance, they felt, of retaining the business.
Have you seen that with networks, for example? There's been exit clauses and exit fees. Are you familiar with that, leaving the captive? I know, but on the independent side, did you ever look at a network, or was the concept not really developed by then?
No, when I left Nationwide, there were no networks at that time. And even with Unimark, and when I came over to Comerica, Mike had just kind of mentioned off to the side the SIAA alternative. Right. But that wasn't what we felt was best for myself and for Comerica and the Unimark business, so we didn't really explore
What was, well, now that you've been on this side, would you say, was it an option, or what kind of led you to that determination?
It was really the fact that Charlie wanted to retire, and so we needed that payment to him as opposed to coming to the network and building afresh. Okay, so it worked out to be the most correct decision for us. If it were slightly different circumstances, if Charlie may have been younger, if Charlie wasn't in the picture, and I was looking at what I wanted to do, maybe that would be something I would consider to develop an agency, still my own, underneath the SIA model. Would have been attractive, but that wasn't the circumstance that we were operating under.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm constantly looking at within competing models, we talk about different networks have different contracts. So you even hear about captive Light Models, which is basically an agency that's on the independent side that only focuses on a few, and they technically own that business, or like the network owns the business. You as the individual do not have the ownership of the carrier contracts. You own the client data, but you don't own the contracts. And you were I think the person that kind of helped me understand the difference between you need to own the carrier contracts as well as the client data in order to truly have that ownership.
Yeah, you are hamstrung if you don't have that ownership of that. Mm-hmm. Just to touch base on what you were talking about, what was available at the time with Unimark and with Nationwide, even at Nationwide, was clusters, because some of the Nationwide agents did leave and form clusters, which is where they'd go in and share expenses. Mm-hmm. At that point in time, it was pretty independent still. They all had their own books. They just shared a pro rata portion or whatever of the cost. And so that was the beginning, I think, of some of the networks and things that grew out of that, was that community and that cooperative nature that came together. And you saw them begin to develop group cluster contracts.
Right.
So if they couldn't get it individually, as a 4 or 5 agent group that had X amount of business, they could go to a carrier and get a contract from that. So that was the beginning of coming together to be able to get contracts from carriers.
Yeah, and I'd say today now is in that concept, does typically one of the members in that cluster own that carrier relationship as the primary? Or have you seen it in a bunch of different ways?
I've seen it a bunch of different ways.
Okay.
Initially, I think it started out with they would each bring a contract of their own, and that would be theirs that they ride herd on. But as it got a little bit more expertise in it, a little bit more sophistication, the group itself would own the contracts. And that would be more fair from each agent's part, because if they left, that agency would retain those. But to your point, that meant the person that was leaving out was going to have to get their own contracts. And starting a Nationwide agency from scratch, even the family agency, which we had and we were working with, those carrier contracts are gold. They're hard to come by, and they have stout requirements, and they're even more so now than they were back then. Yeah. Because carriers are much more selective
on who they do business with,
who they'll do business with, and what they're requiring, and how quickly they'll terminate that contract.
Right.
That was something that was unheard of in the time period that I was working. The first 20 years of my career in the business, they were deep relationships. I mean, if you think about back then, we had the ability to not only issue policies or the requirement to issue policies, but we settled claims. We had the claims draft authority, a lot more authority. So you were truly partners with your carrier, and that has slowly kind of devolved over the years.
For our listeners, as you guys are talking about just clusters, networks, and we fondly call our model an integrator because we really feel that we take the best of all those pieces. Can you guys describe some of the differences there? What is a true cluster versus a network? What are some of the big differentiating factors there?
Cluster is an aggregation of agents that come together to share expenses. Mm-hmm. Don't know how it might have evolved now, but that's how it was back when they were coming into being and when they were developing. The difference between that is you would still each own your own book, still each own your own information. Mm-hmm. It's just where was the carrier contract and where was that relationship? And that, at the end of the day, is a big part of it. I mean, if you don't own that, and I think there are, you and I have talked some, Chris, and there are aggregators or other networks out there that if you leave, maybe you can take the business with you. Mm-hmm. Some will let you do that, but you don't take the carrier contracts. Well, that does you a whole lot of good. If you're sitting there with the book of business and now scrambling.
And I can't represent that carrier for 2 years. What do you do?
That would be even more of a death knell, but you've got to have that. And so then the other side of it, which is who owns the business. I don't know how you could have the carrier contract without the business, but I know there are aggregators out there that own the business.
They retain it.
And I've seen some of those contracts, and we've talked to some agents, that have brought those contracts in, and we said, unless there's some way to purchase out of this, you're going to start from scratch when you come.
Have you had conversations where you are talking to somebody and they're surprised that somebody else actually owns the business? They weren't aware?
All of them are surprised. They did not understand that in the contract. That is something that when it's being explained to them, they're not talking about. Maybe they'll touch on it. I doubt, but
Well, so to that point, they'll brag on the front end to say, hey, we have no exit fee. Well, if they have no exit fee, then now I'm questioning who actually owns the business, because they're going to hit you with a 2-year non-compete associated with moving or placing in that business or representing it, or they require you to put it in a service center for a period of 2 years. And then basically I would call those captive light models. In other words, they're still captive, but on the independent channel. They have access to multiple products, but you can't move that business. And so, yes, our network, the integrator form, does have an exit fee. And that's the whole purpose of that exit fee. Says this is your business. You own the carrier contracts and you own your client relationships. Mm-hmm. Those are yours. So when you decide to leave our organization, you pay out the deferred comp. That's your emancipation that says this is yours.
Your emancipation. That's a great point. What would you guys say are some key things that somebody should be looking at as they're looking at those contracts to understand? Yeah, what are those red flags? What's some, even if you have some blanket verbiage or something that people can parse through to understand who really owns the business?
So I'd start, if I can, back a little bit earlier than that. First is you need to have an understanding of what a contract is.
Yes, read the contract.
And know what you're reading and know what makes a contract. Mm-hmm. So I've had the great pleasure of being able to speak in front of graduating high school senior classes. And I give them 2 pieces of advice. Actually, I give them more than 2, but I'll stick to 2 here. And that's no matter what your major is, no matter what you're going to be taking to study, there are 2 classes you absolutely have to take. First is Accounting 101. Mm-hmm. You've got to understand how to read a financial statement, how those things come together. And the second course is you have got to take a business law class.
Yeah.
You have got to understand what makes up a contract.
That's great advice.
And so if you do, because everything in life is a contract. We're talking about contracts here for agencies, but buying furniture, buying a vehicle, renting an apartment, everything in life is a contract, and you need to understand how to read them and what to look for, because those contracts will dictate what's going to happen in the future, what your responsibilities are, what their responsibilities are. To Chris's point, what are the options that you have as you leave? Everything is spelled out in the contract. And so you need to read it, need to understand it, and need to be watching for the pitfall. Not everybody does a contract that is meant to be 50-50, where both sides, are equally represented. The person drafting the contract will normally and naturally make it tilt towards them. You have to understand that going in. You have to know what is negotiable and what's not. Mm-hmm. You need to maybe push the envelope onto what's negotiable or not. But if you're looking at a contract for an aggregator or with us as an integrator, you got to go down to the basics. Okay, What is it specifying out? Who's going to own what? Who's going to have responsibility for what? All right. So with an agency, and you think about what's involved with that, it's who's going to own the business, who's going to own the carrier relationship, how the commissions are going to be split.
Yep.
Okay. How they're going to be shared. Is there any kind of override? Is there any kind of profit sharing? Mm-hmm. All of those things. How is that paid out? How is it there? To the point about the Comerica Agency Alliance contract, what are the costs involved? But with any contract, what are the costs involved? How are they calculated? How are they collected? When are they due? What's the penalty if you don't pay them?
Right.
What's the penalty for getting out? What's the penalty if you breach? All of those things are going to be specified within the contract. I mean, it's hard for me to sit here in the short period of time we have and say, what are all the pitfalls that you can look for?
Those are great.
About every line in the contract.
Yeah. But those are really good targets right there to talk about the main pieces of it, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily come in and think, oh, you're going to own the carrier relationship, you're going to get paid, and then you're going to pay me. So actually you own the relationship because you're getting paid and then you're just giving me a piece of it. Those are big things.
Well, even when we talk about like the internal MGA model, so we have an internal MGA that allows our agents to place business in, to build a track record to eventually move them to a direct contract. Well, if they don't know this going in, those policies are going to have our name on it. Do they still own that business? Yes. But we put that in the contract itself. It says, hey, you're going to be placing business through our lines, and you own it, but you currently don't have that contract. So until you have that contract, you have to coordinate it, and it's going to have our name on it. Well, as soon as you get that contract, we're going to roll that business out to your direct contract and leverage it that way. But if they were to terminate and all that business still in that MGA, they would still own it. And this is also why we have you can't just terminate and move. You have to work with the carriers on that. So if I have somebody who has a bunch of business with a particular carrier, they don't have the direct code, I'm going to work with them to say, okay, where do you want to move this to? Do you want to move it to one of your direct contract relationships, or can you get access to another MGA to place that business over there? It's still yours. It's just the carrier hasn't given you that appointment yet. Now, you can definitely go directly to the carrier at that point and see if they'll give you one. But often cases, if they would have, we probably would have already gotten you one.
True. Absolutely. It's big differences on how all those things shake out, and it's important to look at it as we build.
And I think you can compare them. What is it? The Ben Franklin, go ahead and make your T-chart.
Yeah.
What's the good and what's the bad, and line them up side by side and look at those key points so that you can make an informed decision. That's what it's all about. You have to make an informed decision. And we've talked to so many people that didn't quite take that time to do that, and their decision was not as informed as it should have been, and they end up regretting it.
Well, in a lot of those cases, I know I've worked with you hand in hand on, the guys leave a captive environment, go to the independent, thinking that they're truly independent, and realize they signed up for yet another captive. And so, I mean, we had one guy that had rebuilt his book 3 or 4 times just because of him, unfortunately, not reading the contract the 4th time he got it, But I think that's imperative that you do read, understand it. And if you don't have that expertise, you can hire an attorney. The key on those is identifying an insurance, one that specializes in insurance. And if you're really wanting to make the deal work, you tell them, look, I want to make this deal. What do I need to know that I'm getting myself into from a long-term perspective? And they can often give you advice around that as well.
Well, there's always been the advice that's age old. You get what you pay for. So when somebody's looking at the different costs to join different networks or whatever, and they're looking and trying to compare, well, this one doesn't have any cost and this one has it. There's a reason for that.
Yes.
Okay, and you need to look at that. You need to understand why they're making their cost. I mean, to the point you were making about the fee that's paid upon separation with Comerica it's calculated based on how much you grow. Okay, so the phrase you say over and over again is, we don't make any money unless you're successful, not any real money until once you're successful. And then we're going to take a part of that success.
We're going to delay our pay so that when you do build that book, that's when we get paid.
We're investing up front until you're successful, then we're jointly successful. And then if you want to exit the relationship, you have that option, but we've got something in place. Because this is something that I talk to prospects about too, is when you join a group, we are building on the power of that group. So no group is going to want to go backwards in premium. We talk often about wanting long-term partners. And John, I'm sure you would say that, and I'd love to get your perspective. But when we talk about business or life, long-term partners go deeper. Those are the people that you want to do things with the right way. And so in a long-term partnership, we're not necessarily looking for an exit, but to your point, Chris, we're going to talk about what that exit is going to look like up front. But no network and no group is going to want you to just leave one day. They're building on the premise that you make up a certain amount of premium and that you're going to have a certain amount of growth. So we've got to prepare for the rest of the group if that day does come, right? Because we're in this together. And so we got to do that the right way too.
It does bring up, if you don't mind, that does bring up a good point. Every group, cluster, network, MGA is going to be different depending on its size. So I'm obviously very biased with SIAA. They're one of the largest networks in the United States. And because of that, they have significant premium volumes with a lot of our partner carriers. What does that mean? We're going to max out most of those deals, which is why we're not the cheapest product. We don't want to be the cheapest network on the face of the earth. We want to be the more value-centric. So, you're going to be paying, but you're going to be receiving so much more value in higher commissions, higher everything, versus, a smaller startup cluster. You could be a big fish in a small pond. I'm paying, $250, $300 a month, and that's it. But what are the actual resources that you're getting? charging? Do they max out the carrier commission tables? Are they maxing out the profit share tables? In most of those cases, they're not. That's why they're charging less, is because they don't have that.
They need rapid growth to get there to even be in the pond, basically, where you're coming into an established relationship here. You have people like John who've paved the way for, 46 years, John, you've been in the industry?
Yeah, keep rubbing it in.
No, I say that.
You look great, John.
I
look
say
wonderful.
that with so much respect because it's not easy to have a career that spans 46 years, but the depth of knowledge that you bring and the fact that you're so open to being able to talk to people, to be able to mentor the next generation.
He works with a lot of our agents as well. I mean, when we have legal counsel or situations pop up with a lot of our member agents, where they're able to give a call to John and say, hey, I'm going through this deal. Can you help navigate me? I mean, that's a resource that you bring just because you're part of the network. I'm sure
it's just because he's John.
Well,
too. I mean,
probably, but
that's what's so incredible about
sheepishly,
it.
we're saying it's just for the network.
And
I was going to say I will more likely take a call from a network member than I will from somebody down the street.
Yeah.
Hey, I heard John's pretty good. I'll give him a call and ask him a question. Probably not going to get much out of me on that.
But genuine on that. I will say, and I'll brag on this piece, and I know this was because it was coming from Chris, but before I had even joined Comerica Agency Alliance, I think I had a close friend that was an agency owner that was going through something, and I was talking to you about it, and you were like, tell him to call John. And he did call you, and you did answer, and you did walk him through the situation.
That was the programs, wasn't it?
Wait,
yeah.
Did it work out okay for him?
It did. Okay. It did. It was fantastic. But I mean, it just goes to show that upfront investment on all parties, right? And it goes back to building long-term relationships, taking care of people, and all that type of.
This is still a relationship business.
Yeah.
As much as it's changed, it still comes down to relationships. So.
And that's a really good point, even when talking about who you tether yourself to in a relationship, right? Whether that's an agency that you work for or whether that's a network that you're a part of as a business owner, what kind of relationship do you want to steward forward? And
what kind of a reputation do they have? That's, those reputations are earned, good and bad.
Yep.
And so you need to look at that and need to talk to people about that. Anybody I'm looking at going to business with, what is the reputation? How do they do business? Do they treat people fairly?
Well, I think that's also to the referral situation. So I'll often, when I have a new prospect, say, look, I don't want to sell you on this. Go talk to one of my other members and get the impression from them, right, wrong, or indifferent. So it's a good opportunity to really get to know that because you'll find that some of the guys are locked in and they can't get out, as well as is there compensation associated with that.
Yeah.
So.
No, these are fantastic insights, and it's so cool to be able to sit around the table with so much experience. This has been a great conversation today on everything from your journey into insurance to contracts to different channels. As we wrap up, one of the things that we like to ask our guests along their professional journey, if there is a book or a podcast or a quote that has stuck out to you that you would like to share with our audience.
So we were joking, and I said the quote that I live my life by is, "It is what it is." Just take it for what what's coming to you, and deal with it the best you can, and work your way through it, and have the confidence that you can. Books, I don't have any favorite book. I'll tell you the one I'm reading right now is called Born on the 5th of July. I'm a member of the Navy League, and we happened to have a luncheon over at a nearby club, and we had a Marine veteran from the Vietnam War who had both of his legs blown off in the Vietnam War, and he's now 74 or whatever. But as he was lying there basically dying in his friend's lap, he talked to God and he said, if you can see your way clear to spare me, I will dedicate my life to you. And that is what he has done.
Very cool.
He is a traveling preacher with no legs, who gets around in a wheelchair, and he was very proud of the fact of nobody helps me, nobody pushes me. I wheel myself onto the plane. He's got like 4 million miles with American Airlines.
Wow.
And he just goes onto the plane. He folds up his chair himself by popping his butt and his hands down on the floor, folds up his chair, puts it in there,